Paul is, if you look in verse 1 of chapter 7, Paul's dealing with a situation where apparently some in Corinth were saying it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And so there was this ascetic doctrine that was saying that, well, we should even forbid marriage. Paul also mentions that in 1 Timothy 4, verse 3. There were those in the Christian circles saying, no, don't get married. That's wrong. And Paul is saying, no, that is not correct. Marriage is the God-given outlet and channel so that we can use our sexuality in that covenant relationship to mirror him and his covenant relationship with his people, as we talked about in our first 4 classes. But that doesn't mean someone who's wrapped themselves up in the darkness of pornography should just get married and that's going to take care of the issue. That's what I was saying last week. I want to make sure I'm clear about that. Any thoughts or questions on that, those clarifications that I just wanted to make? And please, if I start speaking to a comment or even some point I'm making, and you feel like, hey, what you're saying there sounds like someone could take you to mean this, or maybe I took you to mean this, and I don't have enough nuance, please come say that to me, like Sean did, so that I can address that. Because sometimes I know what I mean in my mind, and how it comes out is going to be different for someone who's not a mind reader, which none of us are. Any thoughts or questions or those clarifications that I wanted to make? Well, our lesson today is titled, Why Did God Give Me These Feelings? And when I was preparing this class, you only have a quarter. I had some people tell me, oh, a class on sexuality, you couldn't do a whole quarter class on that. I had several people say that to me. And there was a time where I thought the same thing. It wasn't until I started thinking about it, I realized we have a lot more than a quarter's worth of material. So I've had to cut some stuff out. But I really wanted to make sure that we had a class on this question. Because this question is something that a lot of people wrestle with. You may have wrestled with this in the past. You might be wrestling with this now. And there's bound to be people that you know who are wrestling with this question. Sometimes it won't come out as a question. It'll just come out as a statement of fact. Well, God made me this way. And you'll hear that a lot in our culture and from Christians. But the root of that statement is that they recognize, maybe instinctively, I have these desires and apparently the Bible says not to act on them, but since God made me, then there must be something that's okay with these desires. And so they're getting to this question. Why did God then give me these feelings? I have wrestled with this question. When I was in college, I told someone this. I think it was Dan. I told Dan this recently at breakfast. There was a time, looking back, I can just say honestly, I was ruled by my sexual temptation, my sexual desires. They had complete control over me, over my thinking. And this question, I wrestled with this, even with some anger towards God. Because if you're going to create my sexuality, and then here I am with these temptations, these desires, how can I not get a little angry with the one who seemingly gave me the desires and then said, but you can't do that, don't act on it. Which we're going to talk about here. And that gets into this first question on your page, on page 30. Think through this with me. If God gave you desires, if this is true, if God gave you desires only to tell you not to act on them, what does that say about God? What are your thoughts? If this is true, God gave you these desires and then said, don't act on it. That's going to be against my rules that I create. What's that say about God? Yeah, Mr. Mel.
I think that for every desire that we might have, God has a legitimate fulfillment of that desire. And He's clearly spelled that out.
Yeah.
So the desires to go in a different direction don't come from God, because He says He doesn't tempt anyone.
Yes.
But we know that Satan is there tempting us.
Yes.
And we focused on the fact that he tempts us through what we see on television programming primarily. But he can also appear as an angel of light, as a preacher of righteousness, who's saying it's okay to have these desires.
Yes.
What we have to do when these thoughts pop into our mind And they don't only pop into our mind when the television is on.
Yeah.
Where did this thought come from?
Yes.
And the question we need to ask every time we get any kind of thought.
Yes.
And then what is it trying to do?
Yes.
It's trying to tempt me to step over the boundaries that God has created.
Yes.
Over the legitimate fulfillment. And do something else. And that's Satan's work.
Yes.
And he makes it very compelling. You need to think about this.
Yeah.
Don't ignore it, because ignoring it one way can go away.
Yeah.
And that means you're just going to come back again and again to try and tempt you.
Yeah.
So you have to say, what is God's fulfillment of this?
Yes.
And is it a good thing to think about this thought?
Yeah.
If it's not doing any good, turn your mind to Jesus.
Yeah. The reason there's nothing funny about what Mr. Mel's saying. The reason I'm smiling is he just did my whole class in a two-minute comment there. So we're done. Class is finished. That's it. So, but no. I'm just. Before we get, we're going to unpack a lot of those things Mr. Mel just said. But before we do that, what I want to do with this question is taking this question as it stands. Why did God give me these feelings? I'm wanting us to think about this question, to see where it would lead if we ask it as it is currently worded. Why did God give me these feelings? What if that's true? Let's just take it and say, okay, let's think about this question's assumption that it's making. If it's true that God really did give you these feelings and then tell you not to act on them, what does that say about God? If that was true. Yes, ma'am.
He doesn't say not to act on them ever. He says keep them in proper context.
Yes, that's true. But I guess you could think of it this way, thinking of someone who's wrestling with this question. But, okay, it's a context that is right now not provided to me. You know, I'm not speaking as someone wrestling with this. I'm not married. And so I have these desires. I have these temptations. And so God is telling me, all right, well, don't act on those feelings. And so if that's true, he made me after all. And so these feelings are things that he gave to me. Did he not make me a sexual being? But then tell me, don't act them. So again, I'm being kind of devil's advocate here because I'm wanting us to see where does this question lead if we ask it this way. Yeah, Tiffany?
If you take it on the face of it, if you make me this way and tell us not to act on it, it means he's cruel.
Yes.
And then why did I listen to someone who is cruel?
Yes.
Who has made me a certain way and then will punish me for acting the way that it made me. So then I don't have to listen to him.
That's
then
it.
I listen to myself.
She got it. If this is true, and God really did give me these feelings, and then say, don't act on it, though, don't do it. How can you not avoid the conclusion that's cruel? That's cruel. It's cruel for God to do that. If these feelings really do come from him, he created me to have these feelings, but then set the rules in opposition to those feelings. He then said, but to be my disciple, you're not going to be able to act on those feelings that I gave to you. How is that not cruel of a creator to do? And then second, just hand in hand with that, it's unfair. Isn't that unfair? If this is really true, if God created you and then gave you these feelings, here, I'm going to create Nathan, and he's going to have all these feelings of things he's going to want to do. And I'm putting that into him, but I'm going to then tell him, can't act on it. Can't do those things. It's unfair. This is where this question leads. If it's asked in this way, why did God give me these feelings? Now, something there should be a red flag. And sir, I'm going to get you in just a second. I saw your hand up. There should be a red flag to us, though, if we're wrestling with this question, and we then start to entertain these ideas. Some warning bell should go off in our minds, because who is it who wants us to think of God this way? Satan. After all, this is just the garden all over again. Did God really say, don't do that? Did he really say that? Because that is harsh, let me tell you. God really has it out for you, I think. You will surely not die if you do that. For God knows that when you do that, it's going to make you happier. He's holding out on you. He doesn't really want what's best for you. This is just the garden all over again. Where this question leads, inevitably. Satan wanted Eve to think, you know what, God is a liar. He's told me not to do this because it would be bad for me, but in reality, he doesn't want me to do it because he's holding out on me. Maybe he doesn't really have my best interest at heart. He said I was going to die. Here's Satan saying, you're not going to die if you do that. All right, God's a liar. Then. And so if we're wrestling with this question, and we go to where this question would lead us, we should be able to recognize, okay, this depiction of God, where this question takes me, is so different than the revelation of God that I see in Jesus of Nazareth. Because there is nothing cruel or unfair about God as I see it in Jesus. So I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere in my thinking. Let me go back and rethink through this question to see where I went wrong. And that's what we're now going to do. And before we do that, just quickly, sometimes people will avoid these conclusions because they recognize, all right, well, I know God's not cruel and unfair. So the other conclusion they go to is, well, then these feelings I have, God must be okay with them. And so I'm going to act them out. And that's just, God made me how I am, and so I'm going to act them out. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes people will go to that conclusion because they know I can't go to this one. But this is one destination for where this question will inevitably lead. Now, before we move on, yes, sir, brother, you had your hand up. What was your comment earlier?
Well, the point is, it has to do with our aspect as to where we are in relationship to God. Are we demigods?
Yeah.
Are we God?
Who is it who has moral authority over our sexuality? Is it us? Or is it God? Who is the ruler? Yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah, Julie?
I'd like to also say that we have desires to do a lot of things as well. We have a strong, some people wrestle with a lot of different things. We have strong desires to fulfill an addiction to drugs, to alcohol. People have a strong desire to steal. People have a strong desire to take advantage of other people, abuse people, abuse children. And yet, for some reason, society has put it in our brains that when we give into our desires of sexual temptation, that's a natural thing and it's okay. But when we give into these other desires, well, it's wrong and we should stay away from that. Like, we don't question, why did God give me the desire to, to steal? Because we know it's wrong. We see that it's wrong. Yet we wrestle with, why did God give me the desire to act out like a marriage or whatever? But it's sin. It's also sin.
There's an inconsistency there, and I think that's just Satan's work, is he's gotten our culture to embrace this, and then it seeps into Christians' thinking, because they don't see that distinction. Okay, I'm tempted to drink, let's say, I've got a proclivity or a predisposition towards alcohol, and to my knowledge, I've never heard anyone claim, well, God gave me that. We kind of recognize, all right, well, that's something that isn't God's work, we need to address it. But when it comes to our sexuality, like Julia said, there's a difference. And I think it's because we live in this culture where we're breathing that air. It's like secondhand smoke. Like Sean likes to use that analogy. I like that. We're kind of breathing in the secondhand smoke of our culture. And then these ideas infiltrate our thinking. And we start to think there's a difference with our sexual feelings and desires. Yeah, Jack. And Ms. Brent.
Two things. One, sort of assumes that the purpose of our lives is to have our desires satisfied.
Oh, yeah, very good.
And the second thing is we have a tendency to if we have that attitude, we become preoccupied with the desires and amplify beyond what they really want to be if we had prioritized them.
Very good. Yeah, well said. Ms. Brennan, did you have a separate comment? Or were you? That was it. Okay, you were getting my attention for it. Gotcha. Yeah, very good. So what I want to do now is, let's go back and examine this question. And we're going to go back to even before the question is formed. We're going to first examine what happens with questions when they are asked. Your ability to think means that you can entertain a plethora of ideas about any given subject. But sometimes when we ask a question or when someone asks a question of us, that question is framed in such a way that it limits what ideas are allowed to be put on the table for consideration. I'll give you just an obvious example. So if I ask Sean, just to pick on Sean here for a second. If I ask Sean, have you stopped abusing your wife? Now, we laugh because we recognize this, but think of how this question is framed. Whether Sean says yes or no, the assumption that's baked into the question is that he's at least been abusive to his wife in the past. And the only question now is whether he's currently doing it. If he was to, the only way he could kind of get out of that is to say, I reject the question as it stands. You've assumed that I've been abusive in the past. And so in that question's framework, I've limited what ideas about Sean's behavior are allowed to be considered. I'm not even considering whether or not he's been abusive. I'm only considering whether he's still abusive in the present. It's the same thing with any question about aspects of Christianity or faith. When people ask us questions, or when we ask questions, we sometimes need to go back to the question and examine what assumptions are built into this that maybe would force us to say, we need to reword this question. Because as it stands, it's not valid. I'll give you another example, just a metaphor which we'll use. When you see an iceberg, at the top, it looks like it's just a floating piece of ice. But you and I know that underneath the surface is a whole lot more ice that's holding up that visible part. It's the same thing with questions. And so my second question to you is, on page 30, number 2, what assumptions are being made when someone asks, why did God give me these feelings? That's the surface question. Let's go beneath the surface and see what's holding up that question. What assumptions are being made? We assume, the big assumption is that God is solely responsible for the desires I have. That's the major assumption of this question. God is solely responsible for the desires I have. That's what this question assumes in its current wording. Why did God give me these feelings? Because he's the one who obviously gave them to me. That's the assumption. This assumption is flagrantly unbiblical. And so if we're wrestling with this question, or if we know someone who's wrestling with this question, we have to examine this assumption to ensure that it is indeed correct. And in fact, it is not. There are 3 other forces that the Bible makes very clear that are involved in things that we desire to do. I want to look at those with you. Let's check this assumption. And let's first do it by going to Mark chapter 7. Would you go there with me? Mark 7. And let's see if what Jesus says here supports that assumption. The desires I have come from God. He's the one responsible for them. Look at Mark chapter 7. Look at verses 14 to 23. Mark 7, 14 to 23. And Jesus called the people to him again and said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart but his stomach and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. All of these things that Jesus mentions are antithetical to who God is, to his design, to who he would call us to be in his image. And yet notice Jesus does not say these things come from God. All these desires that may arise in you for murder, slander, foolishness, evil thoughts, sexual immorality, all these things, those desires that you have, God gave them to you. That's not his message. His message is those come from our own sinful hearts. We have rebellious hearts. In fact, just to put an exclamation mark on this, it is absolutely biblical for us to say that God has given us our sexuality. He made us to be sexual beings. That is biblical. He called it good when he created it in man and woman in Genesis 1. But notice then how Jesus discerns between natural, God-given sexual feelings versus what he mentions in verse... wrong page. What he mentions in verse 21, sexual immorality. Notice Jesus makes a distinction. There are going to be desires that you're going to have that will pull you in a direction away from God's design for your sexuality. But those desires for that sexual immorality cannot be attributed to God. They're attributed to our hearts. Because we're rebels. We've all been tainted with sin, and it affects our thinking. It affects our desires. And so when somebody asks, why did God give me these feelings? That question immediately starts off on the wrong foot because it ignores our sinful hearts. It ignores how we are a player in the game in this issue. And so automatically the question starts off on the wrong foot. What questions or thoughts do you have on that point there? What questions or thoughts do you have? Yes, sir.
God is a spirit. He's interested in the spirit. Man is a combination of spirit and flesh. Satan deals with the flesh.
Yeah.
God deals with the spirit, and we're the battleground.
Yeah, I would, and maybe you don't mean how this came out. I would submit maybe it's a disagreement, depending on what you mean, brother. I wouldn't say that God is concerned with our spirit and he's not concerned with our bodies. Because God is going to raise our bodies. Like I talked about in the sermon a few weeks ago with male and female. He is going to redeem our bodies. He is interested in what we're doing with our bodies. And 1 Corinthians 6 makes that clear when Paul's dealing with the Corinthians who are committing sexual immorality. And his whole point is, what you do with your body matters because God is going to raise your body from the dead. Maybe he didn't mean it that way. But I'm uncomfortable wording it as you worded it because I don't want to give that impression that God is not interested in our bodies. He's only interested in the spiritual part of us. Because the biblical worldview is that both make up who we are. Body and spirit, both of those God's going to redeem. And that's just a clarification. I mean, maybe we don't disagree with each other. It's just how you worded it. I'd be like, I just want to make sure it's clear that he is interested in our bodies. Yes, sir, Ken?
No, I was going to say, when he mentioned that, we're the battleground, I think he was tying those together. Satan would have you believe that your body is separate from your spirit and you do whatever you want in your body.
Yes.
It's just a natural, you want to feel that way. You want that thing.
Yeah.
And God is saying, no, your spirit needs to tame the flesh.
Yes, very good. And that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Yeah, well said. Well said. Yes, ma'am. Miss Catherine?
Nathan, you said there was 3 other forces involved in desire. Did you get to those other?
No, I have not gotten to them yet.
Okay,
Yeah, don't worry.
I just want to make sure I'm
Yeah, that's okay. That's right. Yeah, I had someone come up to me, I think it was one of the 1 Peter or 2 Peter class, and they didn't get to fill in the blanks. Like, I have to have the blanks filled out. What are the blanks for there? They just had to have them there. So yeah, I got you. Yeah, don't worry. So this is the first one. The first The first player in the game that the question, why did God give me these feelings? The first player in the game that question ignores is our own sinful hearts. That's the first player in the game that it ignores. The second one is like it, and for time's sake, so that's the internal player in the game. Now we're going to move to an external player in the game. And for time's sake, I'm just using the same passage. So just, if you look back at Mark 7, what I'm about to say is not Jesus' point, but I'm extrapolating something from it that I think we can all understand, and certainly other passages will make this point. All those things that Jesus mentions that come from within our own sinful hearts, if you are living in a culture where these things are openly practiced, do you think that's going to affect you? I mean, just to use something outside of sexuality. If someone slanders me, well, Jesus says, slander comes from your own sinful heart. If someone slanders me, might that external circumstance arouse from my heart the desire to slander them back, or to think murderous thoughts about them? So while that does come from within my heart, it has an external impetus, so to speak. There's an external stimulus there too. And if we're living in a culture where sexual immorality is openly practiced, where things like virginity and purity are mocked, like we talked about a couple classes ago, if sex is thrown in our face, I mean every day, do you think that's going to have an effect? That's going to incite those sinful desires out of your heart in a much greater way than if we lived in a society that honored virginity, that honored holiness, and promoted that? So the other player in the game here, when someone asks, why did God give me these feelings? The other player in the game that question ignores is our society. Because if we're living in a society where these things are put before us, it's naturally going to make those desires worse that are in our hearts. It's going to incite us to feel them in a stronger way than if we were living in a holy society. Yeah, Amber?
I'll try to wrap this up short, but it's kind of big and so parallel to what you're talking about. It's a real-life application that I learned a huge lesson in. I'm so glad that I did before my kids were aware of this.
Okay.
And so I have a loved one in my family, my immediate family, who is making radical changes in his life that is bringing him back to God. And in it, our relationship is like exploding. I'm way older than him, and then he kind of living his life this way, and that's not what our family stands for. And so the conversation that we had just last night started out about substance, an actual substance, and the morality issue of it. But I was able to pray so much good, so many passages and so many things to really open up the hard conversation that was brewing and was coming. And it was just very apparent that it was finally open and ready.
Wonderful.
And I was able to take it beyond the morality issue about a substance and make it about, you're asking for help from God to deliver you from these things, to help you heal, and to make you move forward. You really need to address a huge elephant in the room, and that's sexual sin that has become so normalized that you don't even call it sin. And so if we're willing to ask for God's help and His deliverance in all of these other areas, we need to honor Him with our obedience in the big areas. And the lesson that I learned in it is how permissive he lived his life growing up inside of our own home, because it's hard to talk about. It's hard to imagine that your kids are really doing these things that you don't want to imagine that they're doing. And so the importance of society accepting it, we've got to be careful as parents that we aren't that society. Because sometimes we are, because it's hard to talk about.
Very good. Inaction just aids Satan's purpose. So we've got to be active in how we address these subjects with each other and with our kids. Very good. Very good. Natalie?
I'd say that this means that we have to really be mindful about what we're allowing into our eye.
Yes.
Without ever having seen something, you cannot envision it.
Yeah.
So I can't tell you, I've never been to even Natalie's house, so I can't tell you how many doors are in your home. But if I've been to your home, I can close my eyes and envision and imagine how many doors are there.
Yeah.
Well, the same thing with pornography. If I've never allowed it into my mind's eye,
Yes.
that temptation is going to be very limited.
Yes.
Because I can't conceive it. So this goes back to, it is rampant in our culture. Are we watching it? Are we Netflix subscribers? Are we Disney subscribers? Are we, how many different platforms do we have to put this culture that's so counter to the culture we should be living?
Yes.
We're literally meditating on it day in and day out.
Very good, very good. We've got to be critical about what we're watching and whether. I remember a preacher on the radio. What's his name? He's a preacher at the Moody Church. Erwin Lutzer. Some of you may have heard him on Moody Radio. He said Christians are supposed to know the difference between food and trash, and that just really stuck in my mind. I thought he is exactly right. That's a great way to say it. Yeah, Miss Margaret.
I think it's interesting. I had a conversation with one of my students this week. Trying to help them navigate that possibly a situation was not them being targeted by somebody, but that maybe they had some fault within the situation themselves.
Yeah.
It is amazing in talking with high school students how many times it's got to be an external thing. It cannot be, I did something wrong, and therefore as a result of these things, because society has told them nothing is your fault.
Yeah.
And so even in a really good place where we try to nurture that understanding of being responsible for things yourself, you have to help maneuver them through because they've been told so much other stuff for so long.
Yeah.
So it's a real thing.
Yeah. And that's why I wanted to address these issues. And sister, can I move on just for time's sake? Pardon me. I know some of you have some good comments. Let me just make sure I get through this material today so we can end this class today. The third player in the game that Mr. Mel's already mentioned is revealed to us in Ephesians 6. Just real quick, just turn there, because I want to show you a particular word that's used here, at least as the ESV translates it. So go to Ephesians 6. When we ask, or when someone asks, why did God give us these feelings? It ignores the contribution of our sinful hearts. It ignores the contribution of our sinful society, but it also ignores this external influence that's revealed in Ephesians 6, verses 10 to 12. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. The third player in the game here is Satan. In fact, notice the word that's used in verse 11, that you may stand against the schemes of the devil. The devil is not just, in the biblical worldview, the devil is not, it's just a personification of general evil. No. The devil, the adversary, the Satan, is a living being. He is a malevolent being who is scheming against Christians. He's scheming against humanity. How can I get them to rebel against God? How can I corrupt them? And it's not just him. He has a whole army that have joined him in that endeavor. So when we ask, or when someone entertains the question, why did God give me these feelings? Here's what's happening. Just go back to our question slide. When that question is asked, it is imposing a framework on our thinking that should not be there, because it is limiting the ideas that we can consider within this framework. It's using these assumptions. God is the source of every sexual desire I have. That's what the question assumes. And then the question is also assuming, you can't avoid this in this question, God gave me those desires and then told me not to act on them. Therefore, he must be kind of cruel and unfair. And this question then doesn't allow for these truths that we've just looked at, like Satan's involvement, or being raised in a sexually obsessed culture, or acts that might happen to us in that culture that warp our sexuality, which I forgot to mention. Some of us in this room have gone through things like rape, molestation, sexual abuse. Those things have an effect on us. They were horrible acts of sin done to us. But the unfortunate reality, the heartbreaking reality is, the victims of those acts then themselves have their sexuality often warped to where now they start to maybe desire things that pull them away from God's design because of the horrible act of sexual cruelty that was done to them. And then also this question ignores the sinfulness of our own hearts. And so what I've asked you then on page 31, which I'll just give you my version. You might have one there, based on all this that we've discussed, just so we can wrap up. Rather than asking, why did God give me these feelings, which is the wrong question to ask. It's based on faulty assumptions. It imposes an untruth, a false framework on it. Rather, what we should be asking, as I've worded it, is, why is my sexuality corrupted? And how can Christ help? That is a question that will lead us to truth, or lead another human being to truth, because it's assuming, truthfully, that there is a sexual standard of morality. You can't be corrupted from something if there's no objective standard you need to adhere to. So the fact that it says, why is my sexuality corrupted, assumes and implies that there is a standard that we need to adhere to. And it also allows for all the players in the game. Why is my sexuality corrupted? Well, there's me, my sinfulness of my heart. There's the sexual culture I've lived in. There's things that maybe have done to me as a person, evil things from other people. And there's Satan. All those players are contributing to the things that I am desiring to do. But then the question will also lead us to truth by pointing us to the source. How can Christ help? This question does not view God as an unfair, cruel despot who's created these rules for us because he knows I'm going to watch them squirm under my restrictions that I've given to them based on the feelings that I instilled in them myself. That is not who God is. And this question helps us to avoid that conclusion. Rather, to close, would you just flip over to Matthew 7? I want us to see how Jesus says, here's how you're to view God. And I think this is a good way for us to end today. Go to Matthew 7. And let's look at how Jesus says, think about God this way. This is who God is. He's not cruel. He's not unfair. Matthew 7. And look with me at verses 7 through 11 of Matthew 7. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Satan wants you to view God as cruel and unfair. Jesus says absolutely not. If you want to know how to view God, view him as a loving parent who stands ready to give his children what they need. Those of you who are parents know if your kid comes to you for something that they need, they ask it, and your heart just goes out to them, yes, here. Because you enjoy giving those good things to your children. That's who God is. So if you are wrestling with sexual temptation, sexual desires, go to God with them and talk to him about it. Ask him for strength. Ask him to help you through those issues that may be causing you to have those desires. But he stands ready to help you, just as a loving parent stands ready to help their children. And that's who our God is. Now next week, we will the lesson is called Contemplating Sexual Temptation. And we're going to take a couple of classes to further examine what exactly is it that Satan is doing when he comes to us and incites us to want to rebel sexually. What tactics is he using? What is he getting us to believe? We're going to start examining that next week. I hope you'll be here to join me in that lesson. Thank you so much for your good comments. God be with you this week.